Welcome back to Drinking in the Duat, the podcast where we traverse the shadowy intersections of mythology, folklore, and the human psyche. This is your host, M. Dylan Blair, your guide on this journey through the underworld of stories. Today we're diving into a topic that's as old as storytelling itself, villains. Why do we create villains? Why does every tale seem to need its own antagonist, dark mirror, or monster lurking in the shadows? What do these figures of fear, power, and the unknown say about us, the storytellers? More importantly, what does it say about us as human beings? So pour yourself your favorite beverage, be it coffee, tea, or something strong enough to calm the nerves, because today we're diving straight into the heart of evil. Welcome to Drinking in the Duat, a podcast where the ancient meets the eternal, and the myths of yesterday reveal the truths of today. From the mysteries of the underworld to the whispers of forgotten gods, we delve into the myths, legends, and beliefs that shaped humanity's spirit. So pour yourself a drink and join us on a journey through time, faith, and the stories that bind us all. I hope you're ready. For as long as humans have been around, fear has been one of the most primal forces driving humanity forward. It's wired into us at a core level. From the first crackle of lightning that illuminated the sky, to the roar of predators echoing in the dark, our ancestors lived in a world full of unknowns. As time passed and humans became more apt at living in this confusing new world, they told stories to try and make sense of these threats. And in those stories, they created villains. Think of the monsters of ancient myth, the Greek Typhon, a storm giant said to threaten the very gods themselves. The Norse Fenrir, a wolf destined to devour Odin during Ragnarok, or even the Egyptian serpent Apep, the eternal enemy of Ra. These figures embodied forces of nature, chaos, and destruction, things that humanity feared but could not control. Villains gave these fears a face, a form, something to confront. It's easy to fight a shadow when it has a name, and often these villains weren't just external threats. They represented internal struggles as well. Typhon wasn't just a storm. He was a chaotic force that could unseat the very order of the Greek Olympians, the world itself. Apep wasn't just a serpent. He was a personification of entropy, something that went against those Egyptian world principles we mentioned last week, like Ma'at. Apep threatened the very cycle of life itself. But fear is a complex and evolving emotion. Ancient humans weren't just afraid of predators or storms. They feared the unknown, the vast, uncharted darkness of their world. Every shadow held the possibility of danger. Every unexplained event was a potential threat. This fear of the unknown is what birthed so many of our earliest villains. In these stories, chaos and uncertainty were given form, allowing humanity to grapple with forces they couldn't fully understand. The natural world, with its unpredictable weather, mysterious diseases, and sudden disasters, was the ultimate antagonist. He was always ready and always willing for another round. Losing to it almost certainly meant death. To early human beings, the earth gave no favors, no sympathy. It simply was. Now, the natural world is easily seen with our own two eyes. We can feel it with our fingers and hear it, as the torrents and floods offer no quarter. But let's pause and expand on this idea of internal struggle. Why is it so many ancient villains seem to represent aspects of the human psyche? Well, that's because in Jungian psychology, there's a concept of the shadow, something that we'll cover later this season. But for now, just think of it as the part of ourselves that we deny, reject, or refuse to acknowledge. Villains often embody this shadow, the other part of this duality known as a human soul. Apep wasn't just entropy. He was the fear of the unknown, the end of cycles, the chaos we suppress but cannot escape. Consider how this plays out in more religious narratives. The Christian devil, for example, isn't just there to tempt us. He's the embodiment of humanity's darkest desires, the urge to rebel, to prioritize self over community, and to abandon morality for personal gain. Similarly, the Hindu demon Ravana, though undeniably villainous, also reflects human ambition and the consequences of unchecked desire. But fear isn't static. As humanity evolved, so too did our fears. What began as a fear of the natural world transformed into fears of the self, of society, of power, and of morality itself. These fears are timeless, and so are the villains they continue to inspire. Think about how this plays out in modern times. Where would storytelling be without its adversaries, the antagonists to go up against our hero? Take DC's Joker, for instance. He's the chaotic counterpoint to Batman's order. But he's more than just that. He's the part of us that laughs in the face of rules, that questions the point of it all. And that's why he's so deeply unsettling. He's not just a villain. He's a challenge to the very foundation of our sense of order and morality. That when we play by the rules, we will be protected and be safe. Part social contract, part evolutionary psych. To be a part of the crowd is to afford us certain rights and privileges. The Joker rips the blinders off our eyes and asks, are we sure this is even what we really want? Are we sure that we aren't being lied to? And that, folks, deeply and fundamentally shakes us at our core. It terrifies us. And speaking of terror, what about horror films? Fear of the unknown is at the core of that genre's success. Think of the xenomorph from Alien, a creature that's entirely foreign and operates by its own terrifying logic. Or consider the unstoppable force of Michael Myers in the Halloween series. These villains tap into primal fears, predation, death, and the inability to comprehend or control the threat. They succeed as villains because they strip us of certainty and force us to confront our vulnerability. The fact that unlike the gods, or singular god, we are mortal. In essence, villains are rooted in fear, which reminds us of our fragility. They challenge our perception of safety and control. But, and it's a big but, perhaps most importantly, they allow us to confront our fears in a safe and fictional space. Because when we see a hero face their villain and emerge victorious, we're reminded that fear can be overcome, no matter how hard it seems at the start. But villains aren't just about fear. They're also about power. Power unchecked, power corrupting, or power, frankly, just misunderstood. In fact, some of the most compelling villains are those who wield the power we secretly crave but dare not pursue. For whatever reason, be it big or small, we try to lock that part of ourselves away. And it's only through embracing the storytelling that we live vicariously. In psychology, we call this concept sublimation. We may not be able to take over the world or cuss out our boss, but a villain can. And we, as spectators, will watch them in mock, sometimes abject horror. But to whichever end, a surreal fact remains. The villain did something that we cannot. And we cannot help but keep reading or keep watching to the bitter end. Take Loki from Norse mythology, the god of mischief. He's clever, charming, and always one step ahead. Loki is the chaos we're too scared to embrace, the rebellion that goes against order and expectation. Yet, we find him fascinating. Loki's unpredictability makes him dangerous, but it also makes him free. And isn't that freedom, the ability to act without consequence, something that we've all secretly desired at some point? That need for freedom compels him at an intrinsic level. Why does he rebel? And for what reason does he sabotage his own family and allies? In the end, Loki represents a deep human truth. The need to be seen, to matter. His chaos isn't just rebellion for its own sake. It's a cry for recognition in a world that tries to control him. In this way, he's not just a villain. He's a reflection of our own desires to find meaning and identity in systems that demand conformity. There's a statistic floating around the interwebs that touts you have a 1 in 400 trillion chance of being born. Excluding the math arguments, it only furthers my point. We, as human beings, should be able to be unique without fear of reprisal. But instead, all we find are ourselves being forced into the rat race and cookie-cutter lives. No matter what we profess to the contrary, this is the opposite of what most human beings want. The power that villains demonstrate is often alluring because it represents a freedom that society denies us. Loki's rebellion reminds us of the times we've wanted to defy the rules, challenge authority, or simply act on impulse. But it also warns us of the cost of such freedom: alienation, destruction, and eventual self-destruction. Then there's Lucifer, the fallen angel from Christian mythology. He's a tragic villain, a being of immense power who rebelled against God. Not out of malice, but out of pride and a desire for autonomy. Lucifer's story is compelling because it's relatable. Who among us hasn't felt the sting of being told no, or the desire to carve out our own path, even at great cost? Lucifer's fall raises critical questions about power. What happens when power is denied to someone who believes they deserve it? Is rebellion inevitable? And if so, at what cost? And when is that cost too great? These questions make him a timeless figure in storytelling, and a lens through which we can explore our own struggles with authority and ambition. The old adage that art imitates life is ever more relevant now. Even in pop culture, one doesn't have to look very far to see striking similarities and differences between religious figures and pop references. Take Lucifer and our good old buddy Thanos from Marvel's The Avengers franchise. Both men seek balance and power, but where Lucifer's rebellion is deeply personal, Thanos' motivations are utilitarian. The latter sees himself as a savior, willing to commit horrific acts for what he believes is the greater good. This brings us to a key question. When does a villain's power cross the line from ambition to tyranny? And are their justifications so different from our own rationalizations for selfish or even harmful acts? Power, when it becomes unchecked, often leads to corruption. This theme is universal, often appearing in stories from Greek tragedies to modern superhero films. Think of Macbeth, whose ambitions transform him from a noble warrior on the shores of Scotland to a paranoid tyrant. Or Walter White from Breaking Bad, an American high school chemistry teacher whose pursuit of power and control leads him down a dark and destructive path. But it's not about the villains themselves. It's about the systems they challenge. Villains with power often highlight the flaws in the structures they oppose. Loki exposes the rigidity of Asgard's rules. Lucifer questions the infallibility of God's divine order. Thanos critiques humanity's unsustainable growth. Through their defiance, they force us to examine the systems we accept and the compromises we make to maintain them. In the end, the allure of power in villains isn't just about the power they obtain itself. It's about what that power represents. Freedom, autonomy, and the consequences of ambition. And as we watch these villains rise and fall, we're left to ask ourselves, what would we do in their place? Would we resist the temptation, or would we too succumb? After the break, we'll look at how villains trigger our deepest and darkest fears, not of seizing power for ourselves, but of the bold unknown they represent, and what that does to us as individuals, right after this. Hey there, listeners. Just taking a quick pause to thank you for joining us on Drinking in the Duat. If you're enjoying the journey so far, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps us bring more mythological tales to light. And if you've got a story or question you'd like us to explore, reach out at show@drinkingintheduat.com or connect with us on social media. Now, let's dive back into the mythos. Thanks for coming back. If you find this material interesting, please like, review, and share everywhere you can. It's my goal to bring mythology and religion to the masses. Y'all, there is literally nothing I love more or can find something better to yap about. I promise you, I've got some good stuff coming. If you're ready, let's talk about the unknown. One of the most consistent traits of a villain is their otherness. Whether it's the fact that they're alien, both figuratively or literally, or that they're strange or incomprehensible, whatever the reason, this concept taps into another one of our primal instincts, our fear of the unfamiliar. Think of the Titans of Greek myth, banished because their form and power did not align with the New World Order of the Olympians. They weren't inherently evil, but their differences made them a threat to the emerging hierarchy of Olympus. Or consider modern pop culture villains, like the xenomorphs from Alien, the Demogorgon from Stranger Things, or the Borg from Star Trek. These creatures are terrifying not just because of their physical menace, but because they defy our understanding of life and purpose. Their motives, if they have any, operate outside of human morality. So why do we fear the other? In psychology, we find that this ties back to the part of our brain that formed when we crawled out of the ooze. The primordial or primal brain includes our most basic functions and survival instincts. It's those same components that are wired to perceive unfamiliarity as a threat, a survival instinct from our evolutionary past. One of the most important things to remember in psychology is that everything that is psychological is biological, and everything that is biological is tied to our evolution. For humans to live and exist in this dangerous world, anything unknown could potentially be a threat. So our ancestors learned to approach it with caution. But it's more than just a subconscious instinct groomed by time and fate. Now it's intentional. It's deliberate. So much so that we wouldn't even know what to do with ourselves if we didn't have it. Villains capitalize on this fact, making the unknown tangible, palpable even. And in the end, that embodied reality is something that we as human beings can fight against. But with one twist. Because these villains often force us to confront our own biases and assumptions, we have to defeat ourselves first. Let's take Frankenstein's monster as an example. Created by Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's 1831 novel, the creature is othered because of his appearance and unnatural origin, but his actions and emotions are deeply human. He longs for companionship, acceptance, and purpose. The tragedy of his story isn't that he's a monster. It's that society refuses to see his humanity. This mirrors how we, in our own lives, sometimes other people based on superficial judgments. Villains like Frankenstein's monster challenge us to examine not only our fear of the unfamiliar, but also the consequences of our rejection. Now, consider Bram Stoker's Dracula. The infamous vampire isn't just a predator. He's a symbol of foreignness, a fear of the outsider infiltrating our homes and corrupting our lives. This novel reflects Victorian anxieties about immigration, disease, and changing societal norms. Dracula's otherness isn't just about his fangs and immortality. It's about his representation of the unknown forces disrupting the world of the familiar. In a more abstract sense, the unknown often manifests as cosmic horror. Think of the works of H.P. Lovecraft, where villains aren't just villains in the traditional sense, but incomprehensible entities like Cthulhu. These beings are terrifying precisely because they cannot be understood. They operate beyond our reality, making humanity seem insignificant. This taps into a deep existential fear. What if the universe doesn't care about us at all? Or worse, what if there's nothing we can do to change or stop it? Which leads us to a key question. So when does fear of the unknown become a projection of our own prejudices? Stories that feature othered villains often hold up a mirror to our societal fears. Are we truly afraid of the villain? Or are we afraid of change, diversity, and what it reveals about us? Frankenstein's monster and Dracula force us to confront these biases, asking us to consider who the real villain is, the other or ourselves. And this theme isn't just confined to horror. Even in superhero films, the other plays a role. Think of Magneto from Marvel's X-Men. His identity as a mutant puts him at odds with a society that fears and rejects him. His background as a Holocaust survivor, after witnessing firsthand the atrocities of prejudice and genocide, deeply shapes his worldview and fuels his conviction that mutants must assert their power to avoid a similar fate. While we may find his methods extreme, his motivations stem from a desire to protect his kind from discrimination and annihilation. His otherness is a reflection of real-world struggles faced by marginalized communities. So when we as human beings fear the unknown, are we truly afraid of what's out there, or are we truly afraid of what it reveals about us, about our own shortcomings and failures? Villains rooted in the unknown challenge us to explore these fears and the boundaries of empathy. By giving form to the alien and familiar, stories help us process these complex emotions and perhaps expand our understanding of what it means to be human. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The best villains aren't monsters or forces of nature. They're people, regular, everyday people, twisted by circumstance, ideology, or choices thrust upon them. One of my favorite songs by the Nigerian-Canadian rapper Dax is called The Book of Revelation. The song is an analysis and direct conversation with a Christian God. Towards the end of the song, Dax speaks to God in prayer and asks the following: what if we didn't mean it? What if the place we grew up forgot to teach it? What if we never even got the chance to go and seek it? Then what? Then what? And for many villains, it's entirely the case. For villains like Magneto and Frankenstein, they found themselves shackled time after time, ostracized and abandoned from any semblance of a normal life. And because the world rejected them, they now reject us. And that's what makes them truly terrifying. Because if the villain is just like us, what does it say about who we could become? Macbeth began as a noble hero, celebrated for his bravery and loyalty, and yet his ambition led him down a dark path, spurred on by prophecy and manipulation. What makes Macbeth such a compelling villain is his humanity. His descent isn't abrupt. It's gradual, marked by hesitation, guilt, and inner turmoil. We see ourselves in his struggle to reconcile his desires with his morality. Macbeth reminds us that villainy often begins with a single choice, a moment of weakness that spirals out of control. Or how about Anakin Skywalker, who ultimately transforms into Darth Vader? His journey is driven by love and fear. The love for those he cherishes and the fear of losing them forever. Anakin's fall is a cautionary tale about how good intentions, when paired with unchecked power and desperation, can lead to ruin. What makes his story so powerful is its relatability. We've all been tempted to take shortcuts, to justify questionable actions for the sake of the greater good. Anakin's tragedy lies in how close he comes to being a hero, only to falter at the precipice. Let's analyze one more. Killmonger from Black Panther. His anger, while destructive, stems from a legitimate grievance. He's not evil for the sake of it. He's a product of systemic oppression and personal loss. Killmonger forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that villainy can be born from injustice. His motivations challenge us to consider the fine line between heroism and villainy. Had his methods been different, could he have been the hero of this story? That ambiguity is what makes him so unforgettable. But why are these villains necessary in myth and storytelling? Because they reveal humanity's fragility. Villains show us what happens when we step off the path, or when the path itself is broken. They expose our vulnerabilities, our biases, and our capacity for both good and evil. And in that fragility, we find connection. Villains, in their own way, are as much a part of the human condition as heroes. Breaking Bad is considered one of the best American television shows of all time. The protagonist, Walter White, our beloved high school chemistry teacher, starts as a sympathetic figure, but each turn brings a newfound choice, a new opportunity to choose right from wrong. But as his power grows, so does his capacity for harm, and soon he becomes a man pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond his control. Walter's transformation forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How far would we go to protect our loved ones? More importantly, at what point does necessity turn into greed? His story reminds us that the line between hero and villain is often thinner than we would like to admit. Even the most despicable villains hold a mirror to our humanity. They make us question our own morality, choices, and capacity for redemption. Before we go, consider the words of Dr. Frankenstein. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Frankenstein's reflection speaks to the dangers of unchecked ambition, but also to the regret and self-awareness that define the human experience. In the end, villains aren't just cautionary tales. They're reminders of our potential for both greatness and failure. They are the dark reflections of our desires, fears, and flaws. And perhaps that's why we're so drawn to them. They force us to confront the truth of who we are and who we could become. So, who's your favorite villain? What do they reveal about the world they inhabit? Or the world we live in? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send me a message or comment on our socials. Let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep wandering, keep questioning, and keep drinking in the Duat. And so another chapter comes to an end. But the stories don't just stop here. The myths, the legends, and the questions, they follow us, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be understood. Thank you for joining us on the journey. If you've enjoyed exploring the depths of mythology, folklore, and the threads of belief that bind us, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share the story with others. Until next time, remember, the answers lie not in the light or in the shadow, but in the spaces between. Keep asking questions, keep seeking meaning, and above all, keep the stories alive.